Communication is essentially the exchanging of ideas. When studying communication, it is vital to understand representation and how people both encode and decode these ideas. Representation is the act of encoding ideas into words, art, or any other medium of communication. It is a person's selection of specific elements to describe an object, person, or situation through simplifications and interpretations of the thing described. The person who receives or decodes this idea uses their own mental representations of what is described to understand the communication encoded by the sender. Signification is the use of signs to make meaning. This means our whole experience in the world is a cycle of signification and meaning. A sign is anything with meaning. For example, a word, an image, a sound, and a sign can represent more than one thing at a time, such as an apple stands for both the fruit and the idea of knowledge. In fact, signs never exist outside of a larger set or pattern of symbols and representations. Ferdinand de Saussure posited that signs are made up of two different elements. First, the signifier, the thing that is seen, heard, or felt, like the image on a screen or sounds from a speaker. And second, the signified, the mental concept drawn from the signifiers, like the meaning behind lyrics or the words formed by Braille. Together, the signifier and signified compose the sign. C.S. Peirce expanded on this idea and categorized signs into three different types. First, an icon looks like the physical object it describes. For example, a photograph. Then there's the index, which is a representation related to an object. For example, skull and bones to represent dangerous or toxic. And a symbol is a representation that has no direct resemblance to the object described, such as the Venus and Mars symbols representing the female and male sex. The fact that signs are interconnected in a web of representations leads to two other important aspects of signification. The first aspect is intertextuality, the process of making meaning. This is essentially the meaning one makes depending on influences of past experience that shape the interpretation of routine signs and symbols. For example, a cell phone commercial could spark many reactions or ideas, including its utility or because it's trendy. However, to make connections between the signifier and the signified requires active participation from the individual. The second aspect required to make meaning is called active processing. This is important information in mass communication because not everyone in the population will necessarily decode the same representation and signification from the same message. Advertisements attempt to utilize different levels of interpretation to communicate with broad audiences. So when watching the new cell phone commercial, if you remember that time you were stranded and need your cell phone, the meaning you may create is of great importance and utility. For another person, however, they may relate the commercial to seeing famous people with that phone, and therefore the meaning they create may be of prestige or trendiness. It is the same commercial and the same encoding, but two separate decodings, leading to different reactions. Media can produce meaning through things such as lighting, font, language. There are endless ways to create layers of meaning to ensure their message is received. Since signs are open to various interpretations, they are referred to as polysemic. This can again be broken down into two levels. The first is denotative, the literal interpretation of the sign, and the second is connotative, the subjective interpretation of a sign. For example, with the symbol of an apple, the two levels of meaning that this sign could produce may be denotative as the physical fruit apple, or connotative as the idea of knowledge. The fact that signs are polysemic shows the interdeterminacy of representation. Again, this refers to how the meanings of our representations are determined by patterns of use that may vary across individuals and populations. There are two sides to this. First, the meaning of signs and the messages they communicate are indeterminate because there exists a diversity of representations for an object, action, or event. Well, at the same time, they are considered indeterminate because there is no necessary correspondence between the meaning encoded in a communication by the sender and that decoded by the receiver. So, since decoding messages requires active participation of the receiver, there is no absolute assurance that they are actually receiving the intended message. Still, each representation encoded is based in a schema that hopefully guides the receiver to the intended meaning of the sender. This polysemy and interdeterminacy can be influenced by factors such as the medium in which it is being communicated, rhetoric, how things are said, humanics, how things are interpreted. Social theory was developed to understand these processes of communication. They are representations and a set of schemas of the world. There are a variety of communication theories. Some of them are integrated parts of larger societal theories, such as Marxism, and their purpose is to provide explanations of how the world's details are organized and to guide action, for example, by influencing social policies. This is where Stuart Hill comes in with reception theory. which is centered around the encoding decoding model. This model of communication is exactly how it sounds. It is a process that is composed of the media producing or encoding text with meaning and the audience receiving or decoding a message in a cyclical manner. Encoding is to create meaning in a message, and decoding is to interpret message. However, this model also includes a few other factors. These additional factors try to explain the various ways an audience makes an opinion on the information received. They are dominant readings, oppositional readings, and preferred readings. A dominant reading occurs when the audience decodes the information given in a positive manner and agrees with the message. An oppositional reading occurs when the audience decodes the information given in a negative manner and disagrees with the message. And a preferred reading occurs when the audience has no connection to the information given and both agrees and disagrees with the message. To reach the point of opinion, the intended idea goes through a series of filters. First, a message is encoded. While the information is being encoded, it is influenced by social institutions and culture. It then is filtered through the political and economic climate. The third filter involves institutions again, but this time in regard to institutions of media. An example of an institution of media is the National Film Board. In order to broadcast to their channels, one must abide by their mandates. Then the professional values of the encoders themselves are factored in. All of these encoded features are filtered through a particular medium to be communicated to an audience. A medium is the message or the channel of communication. For example, the channel of communication for our message may be the radio. As the message is broadcasted to the audience, it undergoes further contextual filters. One of the most important filters the message encounters is the personal history of the consumer. This can include past experience, previously held beliefs, current life circumstances, and more. Once the context message is received, again the message filters through the audience's culture. The consumer makes an opinion of the idea when received and filtered through their personal meaning of the idea. There, a dominant, oppositional, or preferred reading will be made. This may lead to action on the part of the media consumer in the form of purchasing, activism, or many other potential actions. Let's look closer at these steps. First, culture, being composed of social institutions, language, etc., influences the message. The social norms and shared symbols affect the ideas people hold about the world itself. The way that the media and equally the consumer draw upon the cultural influences may be different, but it provides a common pool of signs for people to make meaning from. This step occurs for both encoding and decoding. Second, the political and economical influences. Policy, laws, and regulations could influence many aspects of encoding a message, including content restrictions, message formatting, distribution rights, and more. Economics can also influence many aspects of encoding of a message, including funding limitations that could lead to production values, competitive space, etc. We've already touched on media institutions, which control the private sector of media space and regulations, and their mandates must be followed. Closely tied to this is professional values. These values reflect those of the media professionals. Layering many values in one message is the best way to reach wide audiences, and these could be values of the companies themselves, or even the executives, or the brand. Media is the plural of medium. Each type of medium communicates with audiences differently. The medium can affect the structure and content of the idea encoded. For example, the difference in producing content for television or radio. Personal history is the past experience that can affect how a message is decoded. This is incredibly important for this model. This can be formed by social institutions, cultural knowledge, customs, traditions, language, education, etc. Finally, the message context is received and an opinion is generated. This model mainly deals with the way in which encoding and decoding relies on cultures, beliefs, and ideologies that differ from person to person. Hall's encoding and decoding model offers an explanation for how we as an audience decipher and either accept or reject information from the mass media. His model primarily is applied to television media and focuses on how different socio-cultural factors change aspects of viewer consumption. So the encoding-decoding model illustrates how an audience will engage with a specific piece of media and how this change is dependent on multiple factors. The advantages of Hall's model is its elegance to include cultural, institutional, and personal ideologies, and is considered useful for understanding the process of communication. However, this model is criticized for being too simplistic and difficult to apply to many modern forms of communication. Let's review. The encoding-decoding model is one way to explain how an audience interacts with media and accepts or rejects the beliefs ingrained in media messages. Being a social model of communication, this model highlights the importance of social factors in communication, and especially mass media. Communication is clearly a deeper concept than simply the action of making a message or idea common to two or more people. It is a complex concept of representations and significations influenced by many individual and societal factors.